Hey there, this is a review of the Fuji XH2S, and like usual on this channel, I focus exclusively on video stuff. So if you're looking for information regarding photography with this camera, I'm sure there's some other videos on YouTube that you can go check out, but we'll be focusing on video. The Fuji XH2S has an impressive list of specifications, and after using this for a little while, I'm not really sure who this camera's for, and that's what I want to get through with this discussion. We'll go through the camera quite a bit, and at the end, we'll sort of wrap things up with recommendations and those sorts of things. So there is a lot to talk about with this camera, and I can't cover everything in a video without it being multiple hours long, but I'll do my best. So as I said, I'm going to focus mainly on video. We're going to talk about the capabilities, the limitations. We'll do a few tests in this video that I haven't done before. I'm going to look at image quality, the value of this camera, comparisons with other brands and other cameras that are out there. And then the biggest question really is, if you're a Fuji user, should you upgrade from the X-T4? First, let's address probably the biggest question that you have about this camera, and that's how good is the autofocus in video? So for everything that I'm going to be showing you throughout this video on the X-H2S, I'm using the Viltrox 13mm lens. So take a look at this test. From looking at this test and also just in my use in the last few weeks, I think the autofocus is definitely getting better with Fuji, but it's not at the same level as Canon and Sony. And when I shot my first impressions video, I thought it did a great job, but then after I posted it, a few of you pointed out that there was some pulsing in the background while I was talking and moving my hands. Again, I didn't even notice that, so that was interesting. And also while I was doing my dynamic range test, I noticed when I was about 2 2/3 stops or 3 stops underexposed, the camera really started struggling grabbing autofocus. So I think it's better. Is it as reliable as Canon and Sony? I don't think so. In a well-lit shot where the subjects aren't moving a lot, I think it can be reliable, but it's one of those things. Now, lenses play a big part into how well the autofocus works. Philip Bloom made an incredible video about the autofocus on the X-T4, which I'll leave linked down below. He goes through settings and different lenses and all that stuff. So if you're interested in getting the Fuji autofocus to work and the limitations, I highly recommend that you check out that video. In addition to Philip Bloom's video, Joshua Martin made an awesome video over on his channel called Cine Dailies that's all about the X-H2S's autofocus. He tests out a whole bunch of lenses. I recommend you check that out. I'll leave that link down below as well. Next, let's talk about IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. There are a few different options for that in this camera, so let me show you that, and then I'll show you some tests. So if you go into the menu here, we go to the IS mode, you can leave it off. The first option here is IBIS and optical image stabilization, so that's running IBIS, the physical sensor stabilization plus any lens stabilization if you have it. This is IBIS plus digital stabilization, and then you also have a boost mode here, which is used for like a locked off tripod shot. So for these tests here, I first did a walking test. I was just hand holding the camera by the lens without a tripod or anything, and I was not being careful whatsoever, so it was a pretty rough test. And then the second part is hand holding it for a static shot, and take a look. And don't think the walking stabilization was anything to really write home about, but again, I was being pretty rough on the camera. But I think holding it for a static shot, I think the IBIS plus digital stabilization and or the boost mode worked really well for getting a solid static shot without a tripod. I was definitely impressed by that. Now with rolling shutter, that's a question mark that everyone always has about video. And the rolling shutter is basically non-existent on this camera. This has a backside illuminated stacked sensor for very quick readout, so you're not gonna have any issues with rolling shutter. In terms of battery life and overheating, neither of these are really a concern for me. The battery life is incredible on this camera. I took it out for a couple hours shooting and I drained not even half a battery. I didn't have any issues with overheating out in the heat while I was filming. It was pretty warm while I was out filming. I didn't do any extensive overheating tests. There is a fan that you can put on the back of the camera. There are screws for that and it mounts here. So if you're running 4K 120 for extended periods of time or it's really hot, you can buy that fan from Fuji and it screws right in here. This is the place where the electronics connect. So again, I don't think overheating is really gonna be an issue with this camera, and the battery life has just been awesome. Now let's talk about the build quality and the physical characteristics of this camera. And for a lot of Fuji users, especially if you own like an X-T3 or an X-T4, you may not like this because it lacks all the dials that you usually see on the top of Fuji cameras, but this definitely looks a lot like the X-H2S and even looks a lot more like their GFX series cameras. I personally really like the layout of this camera and the way it feels and operates. I like the buttons and those sorts of things. So let me give you a little tour around this camera. So just starting with the top here, we have a mode dial here with 7 custom settings. Each of these you can customize to either a photo or a video mode, so that's really handy. And then over here you have a screen, which when you turn the camera on, it will put on a bunch of information. If you press this button here, you can change it from black on white to white on black. And personally, I don't use this screen very much, but it is there. You have some nice buttons on the top here, and like I said, I really do like the buttons, and I feel like this camera is geared towards videography. I feel like the button layouts and even the customizable buttons were kind of set up for what things I would want right out of the box, which is really cool. So we have our shutter button, the on-off switch, the record button, but I just usually use the shutter for record. The ISO, white balance, these are buttons you're gonna need all the time. This is a customizable button. This one comes set for turning eye face detect on and off, which is something I always have a button for. And I'll talk about the ISO button in a second. Onto the back, we have a couple more buttons here with a normal sort of layout. We have a flip screen, which I believe is the same screen from the X-T4. So no real complaints about the screen. Over here, we have our media. So we have 2 different options. First off, we have the SD card, which I use these ProGrade V90 cards because they work in all my cameras, and I can record everything on this except for ProRes. And if you want to do ProRes, you need to get a CF Express Type B card, and I don't have one, but I'll leave links down below for cards I recommend for both of these. The battery on the bottom, as I mentioned, is great in terms of battery life. This is the same battery that's in the X-T4, solid battery. Over on this side, in terms of ports, we have USB, headphones, mic, and a full-size HDMI, which makes me very, very happy. One thing I do want to point out about these flaps is that I don't like the feel of them. They're very thin, and I don't like these dangly flaps in general. I hope that camera manufacturers are kind of getting away from these. They're just annoying, and I just don't like the way they feel, but that's just, again, personal preference here. Onto the front of the camera, we have a couple more buttons. This one here is set to changing autofocus to manual focus, which is super important to have. This button over here is also a customizable button. Out of the box, it comes set to turning the horizon level on and off, so I think that was a good thing to have too. Now, overall with this camera, I really do like the deep grip. I think it has a really nice feel to it. There is just enough buttons on here, and it's kind of a bigger camera, especially for an APS-C camera, which I prefer a lot being a videographer. But overall, I do like the size and the grip and the feeling of it, but the material itself, I'm not the biggest fan of. I think the build quality could be a little bit better. It definitely doesn't feel like a cheap camera, like it has some weight to it and some heft, but I just don't, personally prefer the texture on it. One other thing I want to mention, which I said before about the ISO button. Now, there's only 2 control wheels on this camera, or dials. There's one on the front here for controlling shutter speed. There's one on the back here for controlling aperture. But I'm seeing this more as a trend now, is that we're not getting that control wheel in the back for changing the ISO. So if you want to change the ISO, you hit the ISO button, and then you make the change. So as I said, this is really geared towards videography, but there's a couple things in here that are good and bad as well. One thing I really love is the shutter speed, for example. You can set it to 1/48, which is really cool because if you're shooting 24 frames a second, you don't have to go to 1/50, you can go to 1/48. Will anyone really notice? Probably not, but it's really cool. One thing I do want to point out that I don't like is that is the histogram, that little gray box there. It's absolutely tiny. So that's a big bummer, but I'll get into more of that kind of stuff and things that I don't like with this camera. Now that we got a tour around the camera, let's talk about the recording options and codecs, because I think that's where this camera gets really, really interesting. So the headlines feature for me is that it shoots in 6.2K open gate. Now, if you don't know what open gate is, that's where you get a full readout of the sensor. So a lot of us are shooting on hybrid cameras that are set up for photo and video. So in photo mode, it's gonna take a picture that has a ratio of 3:2. And so generally when we're shooting video on cameras like this or other hybrid cameras, we'll get a 16:9 like UHD or 17:9 DCI output, and just it crops out the top and the bottom. So with this, you can actually get a full readout, and it's really cool because it's just a different aspect ratio to play with, but also you can record one time and crop it for different things. You know, you can use it for UHD, you can use it for DCI, and you can even use it for vertical video because you're saving a lot more of that vertical real estate on there. And it's just really cool to just read out the whole sensor. I really hope that other camera companies start doing this. It just seems silly to me that we can't get a full readout of the sensor. Now the 4K on this camera is really, really nice, and you get an oversampled image. I'm not sure what the original resolution is, probably around 4.8K because that's what you get in RAW and 16:9. But if you shoot 4K 24, 30, or 60, you get a full sensor readout, which of course this is an APS-C sensor, so it has a 1.5 crop. But if you do 4K 120, you're gonna get a 1.29 times crop on top of the 1.5 APS-C crop in this camera, which results in a 1.935 times crop. So you just gotta keep that in mind. If you're shooting 4K 120, just keep in mind about that extra crop. Now, as I said, this camera has a lot of options for shooting video, so let me show you in the camera here. So if we go into the menu and we go to the movie mode, you can see we have the 6.2K open gate at a 3:2 ratio, so you can shoot at 24, 25, or 30 frames a second. You also have 4K UHD 16:9, you can shoot 24 up to 60 frames a second. You also have DCI, which you can also shoot up to 60 frames a second. And if you go under the recording media settings, there is almost an overwhelming amount of things in here. I think this is actually a little bit confusing. So what I usually recommend if you have a camera that can shoot 10-bit 422 is that you shoot in 10-bit 422. So there are a lot of H.264 420 options, but for 422 you have two options. You have all-eye and long op. I generally shoot in long op because it's a smaller file size. And for me, I don't shoot a lot of fast moving stuff, but if you want, you can shoot all eye. But what's weird here is that when you go under the bitrate settings, there's so many options from 50 up to 720, and this is independent of what frame rate you're shooting in. So you have to sort of guess what is the best one. You don't want to just like, you know, use a huge bit rate if you don't need to. And so generally for most of the stuff, and I don't know, I haven't done a ton of experimenting, but I generally shoot in long op at 200 megabits per second when I'm shooting in 24 frames a second. If I'm shooting in a higher frame rate, then, you know, you might want to change the bit rate. So again, it's a little bit, there's a little bit too many options, if that makes sense. I wish I was a little more streamlined so that when you went in there, you kind of knew, like if, you know, you go into other cameras like Canon, Sony, they either have one or two options for each frame rate at a certain codec. And if you want to shoot 4K 120, go under the high speed record, and you can set it up that way. And it works very similar to, you know, like S&Q or the S&F modes in the Sony and Canon cameras. In addition to that plethora of codecs, frame rates, bit rates, and aspect ratios, you can also shoot ProRes internally in this camera on a CF Express Type B card. So let me show you that here. So I don't have a CF Express Type B card, but when I go in here, you can see there's ProRes HQ, ProRes 422, and ProRes LT. They're grayed out because I don't have that card. Now, the other crazy thing about this camera is that you can shoot in ProRes RAW externally. So you can shoot ProRes RAW externally to an Atomos Ninja V+. You can also shoot B-RAW externally to a Blackmagic Design external recorder as well. So if we go in here, I can show you to the HDMI output settings, and we can turn the RAW to on. And there's two different options for Atomos and Blackmagic. So if we go under Atomos here, there's two different options. You can shoot 6.2K 3:2 open gate RAW, and you can shoot that up to 30 frames a second. You can also shoot 4.8K in UHD 16:9, and again, you can shoot up to 60 frames a second there. Once you put it in RAW, there's a few things that change in this camera, so let me just show you those really quickly. So first of which is the stabilization. You can't use the digital stabilization anymore. And it was also interesting that it defaults to the ISO of 1000, because in Flog 2, the base ISO is 1250. We'll talk more about Flog 2 a little bit later. Now, this is actually more of a true RAW than some of the other RAW options that are out there, like from Canon. You can, even in Final Cut, when you bring it in there, you can change the ISO and the white balance in your editor. So that's really cool. If you're into that sort of workflow, it's there. File sizes are very big. You're also gonna have to deal with more noise in the image. But again, for the people that are interested in shooting ProRes RAW or B-RAW on this camera, you do have that option. As I said, this camera really is geared towards videographers, and there's some amazing audio capabilities in this camera too. Let me show you some of those. So over here, we can change our mic jack from mic to line, which is really cool. So if you're gonna plug in a mixer or something like that, where you have a line level coming out, you have that option. You don't see that very often on cameras like this. You also have a level limiter, so that's really cool to have a limiter built in. You also have a low cut filter, and the other thing is you can buy the Tascam unit that slides into the hot shoe here, and you get XLR inputs. Next, let's talk about the dynamic range of this camera, and I was very impressed. I made a video comparing the dynamic range of this camera against the FX3, which is known for having a lot of dynamic range. I'll leave a link for that video down below. You should definitely go check it out. But overall, I'd say this got about a half a stop more dynamic range than the FX3. Again, very impressive. The other thing is I tested low light in a separate video of this camera against the R7 and the FX3. I think this camera held in there really well, especially as an APS-C camera, very comparable with the R7. Of course, when you get to extremely high ISOs, something like an FX3 is gonna be better. But in Flog 2, this also doesn't shoot above ISO 12,800. Now, a big part of the image of this camera is the noise quality. And it looks different than in other cameras. It's a lot blockier. A lot of people think it looks more organic, and a lot of people prefer it. But a big variable here is going to be the noise reduction in the camera, and it puts a lot of noise reduction starting around 4,000 ISO. And for best results, I recommend that you just leave it off and then apply it in post. Now, one thing I noticed was even in situations where you're pushing or pulling the camera and the highlights or the shadows, or in low light situations, that the image on this camera really does hold up well in terms of the color and the detail. So if you can clean up the noise in post, I think you'll get a really awesome image. Like all other Fuji cameras, the X-H2S has all those cool Fujifilm simulations, which people use on a regular basis for both photography and videography. For me personally, they're not really my jam. I'm generally shooting in log, trying to eke out as much dynamic range as possible. That's kind of what I like to do. So I was mostly curious about shooting in Flog 2 on this camera because of the increased dynamic range and that it's a new log offering from Fuji. So I was really impressed, as I said, with the dynamic range and the overall image quality. But overall, in Flog 2, I was getting a very strong magenta cast, and it's just something to be aware of. It's part of the color science. I also saw it in Flog, but not as strong. I didn't really see it as much or even at all in some of the film simulations, but I've even seen this in the X-T4 when I had that in Flog. So it's part of the color science. Every color science has a different cast of colors and the way the colors work, and you have to get used to it. Let's talk about the image quality. Of course, is a very important part of every camera. Overall, I was really impressed with the image that came out of this camera. I really enjoyed shooting in the 6.2K open gate as well as the oversampled 4K. It produced a really detailed and sharp image with some really vibrant colors, and I really did enjoy shooting in Flog 2. One thing I did want to say about shooting Flog 2 is you just want to be really careful that you don't blow out your highlights. You really need to protect them because they clip a lot easier. And the other thing is with the higher base ISO of 1250 that's in Flog 2 versus 640 that's in Flog, you just got to be really careful with your highlights. An important discussion to have about any camera or any camera system is going to be about lenses. Now, if you're looking for video lenses that have decent autofocus performance, this is where the X-H2S and the Fuji system struggle in general. Now, many of Fuji lenses are older and they are optically very good, but they're designed for stills and not for video. So you'll have inconsistent autofocus, you'll have pulsing and hunting and those sorts of things. As I said before, go check out Philip Bloom's video, and he goes through and tests a lot of lenses and gives you a lot of opinions. As I said, I only have the Viltrox 13, and from what I've seen online from other reviews, it acts kind of like a native lens, and I kind of agree with that with my own experience. There's some other lenses that I've heard do really well, like the 16 to 55 f2.8 and the 18 to 55 f2.8 to 4. There's probably some other ones out there, but in general, if you're looking for an autofocus lens for video for the Fuji system, there really aren't a lot of good lenses to choose from. Hopefully there will be some in the future, but right now we don't really have those options. Now I want to talk about some of the things I don't like about this camera and some of the things I've already mentioned. First of all, the histogram is absolutely tiny and basically useless, and it makes it really hard to judge exposure. I wish we had a larger histogram. I also wish we had more monitoring assist tools. Like I've been saying for a lot of other cameras, we need things like waveform and false color. The limited lens selection for autofocus for video is a real bummer for the Fuji system. The autofocus in general, I still think needs work and needs to catch up with Canon and Sony. It's not fully reliable at this point in every situation. Of course, as I said, in controlled lighting and certain situations, I think it'll be pretty good, but it's definitely not as reliable as some of the other systems. And the color science, I think for a lot of people, is something they love about Fuji. For me personally, I do like a lot of the things going on with the colors, except for that Magenta cast. Now let's kind of talk about the competition. I think this is really hard because the X-H2S is a very unique camera, and I think a lot of camera companies, as crowded as the market is, they're sort of carving out their little niches. But let's go through a few examples here. So the Canon R7, I know, very different camera, but it's kind of the closest thing in the Canon world. They're both APS-C. They're both oversampled 4K images. Of course, this shoots up to 4K 120, whereas the R7 only shoots up to 4K 60. This has way better dynamic range. The R7 has better autofocus. The R7 also struggles within the lens department, but you do have more options with EF lenses and things like that, and some more expensive RF lenses. There's a huge price difference though, and this is where I think this is really hard to compare. This camera sells for $2,500, whereas the R7 sells for $1,500. So if you're looking for a camera with much more reliable autofocus and maybe you're in the Canon system, I'd probably stick with the R7 versus the X-H2S. Again, really hard comparison with the R7 and the X-H2S, but it's the closest thing I think we have with Canon. Now let's talk about Sony. And again, Sony doesn't have really anything comparable here. They don't have a high-end APS-C camera. And I know there's some rumored cameras coming out, but we don't have those yet. I think that really the closest camera to compare this to in the Sony world is going to be the A7 IV. Again, that's a full frame camera. So for a lot of people, that's a benefit over the APS-C sensor in the X-H2S. They both have an oversampled image, which is great. You don't get 4K 120 in the A7 IV. You also don't get all those crazy video specs like DCI, OpenGate, ProRes RAW, etc. The A7 IV has terrible rolling shutter, but the A7 IV has incredible lens selection, which I've been saying about Sony lately, is that you can get any lens you want from Sony and third-party options. So a lot more flexibility there. And like with most things, when you're choosing a camera, you have to decide on what you need and which system is going to be the best for you, because there's no perfect camera. Now, if you don't care about autofocus, I'd say there are a couple other cameras to consider here to be like the Panasonic S5, which is a full frame camera and definitely a little bit cheaper, or the Blackmagic 6K Pro or the 6K G2. But if you care about autofocus, as I said, the closest comparables are probably going to be the Canon R7 and the Sony A7 IV. I think the biggest competitor to the X-H2S is going to be Fuji's own X-T4. And I think for a lot of X-T3 and X-T4 users, they're probably wondering if they should upgrade to the X-H2S. And for a lot of people, I'd probably say no, unless you need some of these additional features. And if those are important enough for you to upgrade, then you probably should. But let's go through some of the details. So first of all, the X-T4 has a 30-minute record limit. So if you're looking for long-form recording options, you got to go with the X-H2S. It's really nice not having a 30-minute record limit. They both shoot in 10-bit 422 and 4K, which is awesome. The X-T4 can shoot up to 4K 60, whereas this can shoot up to 4K 120. You get a very similar image quality, in my opinion, with both cameras, but of course you don't get Flog 2 in the X-T4 with that extended dynamic range that you get in the X-H2S. You also don't get those other cool features like 6.2K OpenGate, ProRes internal recording externally with ProRes RAW and B-RAW. So if those are things that you really think you need on a regular basis, then you probably know that you should upgrade to the X-H2S. But as I said, overall image quality and the usability of the camera, the autofocus, I didn't directly compare them, but I didn't see it to be a huge upgrade. Same thing with the IBIS. I think if you want to stay with Fuji, I think you get a lot more bang for your buck buying maybe 2 used X-T4s for the price of 1 new X-H2S. You can find X-T4 right now for, I don't know, $1,200, $1,300, which is an incredible value. Those are great cameras. All right, so I've been talking for a while here. So let's try to wrap up this review, talking about the value and who I think this camera's for. This is where I really struggle with this camera because $2,500 for this camera, I think it does a lot, but it's also very expensive. So I think if you're a hybrid shooter and you really do enjoy a lot of the photo capabilities of this camera, like the film simulations and all that kind of stuff, and you're doing some occasional video and you want some high-end specs, I think this could be a great camera for you. If you're very serious into video though, I think there are some other options you should think about. I honestly think you should probably save up a little bit more and go for something like an A7S III or an FX3, or maybe save a little bit of money and get a Canon R7 that has a little bit fewer features, or a lot fewer features, but save some money. But with the Sony cameras, you get full frame, you still get 4K 120, you get raw external recording, you have unbelievable lens options with the E-mount, you have great autofocus. I think if you want to stay with Fuji, I'd probably recommend sticking with the X-T4 for most situations, because you're going to get a similar image quality and user experience. But for certain niche features this camera has, for example, like the 6.2K open gate, can be really cool because you can shoot one piece of content and then reformat it for lots of different types of social media, including vertical content and all those kinds of things. Hopefully I gave you some good information in this video. This is a very confusing camera, but it has a lot of great features, and I really hope to see a lot of these features trickle down into some of their lower end cameras, of course, this being their flagship camera. So whenever they come out with the X-T5, I hope it has a lot of the stuff that's in this camera, because there's a lot of really cool tech. Hopefully you enjoy this. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.